Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Chris, and this is Regular Guy Training. So, we're going to talk about a couple of things today. I get requests on, taking guns apart and cleaning them all the time. So, while I sit here and talk about certain things, I am simply going to start taking this gun down. Mostly because you don't need real specific directions with me highlighting things and circling shit for you to get a thorough understanding of how to take an AR style rifle apart. Okay, because separating the two halves, getting them apart, and then cleaning some stuff is really not the difficult part. The difficult part is where a lot of people get wrapped around the axle as far as what to do next once it's apart and all that stuff. Now, as far as like military training and that kind of thing, military guys are taught to be very aggressive with how they clean their guns. Okay? Get them white glove clean, that kind of stuff. I still see that kind of shit all the time. All the time. And I do have certain opinions on that, and I do have certain things that I would like to say regarding the super aggressive cleaning and all that jazz. So we'll go ahead and get to it here. But as far as getting it apart, real easy. I mean, like there ain't really much for me to have to go into deep detail and explain. But there are a couple of things that I do want to sit here and talk about. Number one, let's talk about the moving parts wipe down. Now, before I pretty much go anywhere else, I'm going to go into cleaning out the lower receiver. And the reason why the lower receiver is a big deal for me here is because if I don't mess with it soon, I will simply forget it, right? So I'm going to take my little shop rag here, and I'm just going to go over some stuff. Like I'm gonna make sure that my hammer is cleaned out and that kind of thing. But there is a couple of things that I see a lot of guys just kind of gloss over, or just not talk about at all. That can actually mess with your individual performance on a rifle. Now, anybody who's done a lot of shooting, who's been to a bunch of classes and that kind of stuff, particularly classes with like higher round counts where, you're in the 1,000 to 2,000 round range or 1,500, that kind of thing, you'll start to notice that, sometimes your safety may actually end up kind of difficult to work, okay? To where it just feels crummy. It feels like there's too much grit in there and that kind of thing. And after a while, lower receivers will start just collecting junk. Okay. Like you'll see a couple of things, like, just like little grass fragments and stuff here and there. But making sure that what's inside of here is clear is actually pretty important, because if what's in there doesn't get out of there, it could ball up, it could start fucking with your sear and that kind of stuff. And all of that translates to making sure that this area right in here is clear of junk. Okay, now I'm talking about just right in there. Just making sure that anything large isn't in there, like you don't have any little wood chips or fucking gravel or whatever in there. And you can just basically just kind of get that stuff out, and you don't have to worry about your system locking up. Now you can see if there's a couple of like real dead grass clippings in there. That's really not that big of a deal. It's not something that I am too terribly worried about. But what I also like to do is I just like to go in, make sure that I get a little bit of that carbon and stuff off of that lower area that I was talking about. You're not going to get all of it out of there, but it helps. And once you've gone in there and gotten some of that stuff out, you can actually go after your safety lever here and making sure that you get some of the junk off there, because direct impingement system gets gas everywhere. It's not as bad in a lower receiver, but it still gets in there. And if you're just lubing it up and throwing lube back in there and then gas and then lube and then gas and then lube and then gas, you'll notice that your safety starts getting a little sluggish. Now, in the field, a couple of drops of oil and this slicks back up again, right? And we're talking about the safety lever itself, right? And that can actually affect your performance a little bit, because chances are you're not expecting it, and especially if you train, you feel a certain amount of weight when you throw your safety lever, and it'll throw you off a little bit. Not too terribly much, but it will slow you down. So, making sure that your lower is just free of stuff that'll cripple your rifle, because similar to a 1911, if you have too much crap go into your lower receiver and get into like your sear and all that stuff, you can start having problems. Most of the time when you see AR style rifles go down, it's because junk got in there and now the gun isn't resetting and all that shit. Charging handle, really no big deal at all. Even if you just leave this fucking thing alone, quite frankly, you're not going to hurt anything. But just for the sake of you know, making sure that I cover all my little bases and make sure that I don't introduce too much old stuff as far as carbon with new stuff, you know, I'll just clean it out. Really no big deal. Some of that admittedly is carried over from military circles. Now your bolt. Now your bolt here, there's always some contention here and there about how hard you should clean this thing. As you can see, what I'm going through right now is I'm simply just cleaning this guy off. I'm giving it a wipe down. I'm cleaning all black crap off of it, and making sure that my lugs are cleaned off well. And cleaning the lugs of carbon isn't the important part of cleaning this thing off. The important part of cleaning your lugs off is so that you can properly inspect them. Because if there's stuff that breaks on an M4 bolt or an AR or an M16 bolt or whatever, right? If there's stuff that breaks on the bolt, it's right in the cam pin area. That's usually where they tend to just kind of snap in half. I've seen that happen before. And you have lug shearing. And generally speaking, you're looking at these two lugs here and here. These two. Because on your mill standard bolts, like this one here is a Daniel Defense bolt, right? It's not fully supported, okay, around the case head. So these two are your weakest lugs, and if you look at it, you can start to look for cracks, tiny little fissures, gouges, that kind of thing. A little bit of rolling here and there isn't that big of a deal. Like you can see a little bit of metal rolling on this guy. That isn't a huge deal, but when you start seeing cracks, little fissures in the metal itself, that's when you have issues. In this particular one here, we're not running into any real problems, so okay, cool, good to go. Now, as far as getting in here and getting this guy cleaned out, okay, the only real thing I'm concerned about over everything else is I don't want too much slop to get in here and to prevent my firing pin from being slammed forward once it gets hit by the hammer, which admittedly is very difficult to do. Like you have to put many thousands of rounds and follow it up with oil and dirt and all kinds of shit. But just making sure that there ain't a possibility that that's going to happen, you know, you just give a little bit of a wipe down in there, give it some freedom to move around, and you'll notice that this isn't like incredibly detailed. I'm not sitting there trying to white glove this thing, because as far as trying to white glove clean your guns, generally speaking, that leaves them real dry. Generally speaking, that really hurts as far as maintaining some finish, because there's no like oil assistance as with the finish itself, and that depends on the oil you use and all that stuff. But if you're constantly drying out metal components are a lot like skin. They're fairly porous, and if there isn't some kind of slickness going in there and you make them real dry, just like skin, over time it'll get real weak, start cracking and that kind of thing. So speaking of cracking, I'm going over to my extractor here, and I'm making sure that it's given a quick wipe down and all that stuff. Again, much more than getting the junk cleaned off, it's cleaning it off so that you can properly inspect it. Now, once you've got that cleaned off and you start inspecting it, you look for chipping, fissures, that kind of thing. The fissures meaning cracks, that kind of deal. So really no big deal on that one there as well. Okay, I'm going to make sure that I don't have any coils broke off of my spring and that kind of deal. I'm going to look and make sure my little rubber O-ring is intact. So again, no big deal on that front. Okay, and then from there, I'm going to actually look at my little rubber O-ring here. That's in a lot of AR style guns. And I'm going to look for anything significant as far as just like tearing or gouging or any of that, right? So you can see that there. It's worn. It's got a little bit of a groove worn in from the spring and it pushing itself into it, but it's not crazy, right? And that's what we're looking at here, is to make sure that is not starting to try and tear. And of course, if you see that kind of stuff, the first thing that you're going to start doing is replacing those parts because they're not doing their job anymore. Okay, yet again, cam pin. Okay, again, far more important than getting the crap cleaned off the gun. And you'll notice that there is a little pattern here. It's a cleaning as well as an inspection of the parts. Okay, so we're cleaning this guy off here. Once we got it cleaned off. Oh, come on, focus. You can see how it's worn. Okay, now this guy's got a lot of use on it, so you can see that there's some polished out parts and that kind of thing. And again, no fissures, no crazy amount of wear, just a lot of polishing from a lot of cycles. No big deal there. Now we're going to move on to our carrier. Now there are a lot of people that get absolutely ridiculous about how this carrier is cleaned out. I've had plenty of supply sergeants that would absolutely crucify you if there was anything on this carrier at all. You want to know something crazy? The carrier isn't even really that important if we're trying to make sure the gun still works. As far as me cleaning the outside of it, and this is just what experience has taught me and that kind of stuff. If all of this other stuff is cleaned, shoved back into the carrier, you throw some more oil in it and then cycle it a bunch, really it's no big deal there. Okay. However, the big reason why I am cleaning this guy off right now is because, again, it's more of an inspection than it is a cleaning, right? I'm going to clean this guy and I'm going to make sure, like wipe it off and make sure that my staking is still good, which you can usually see real well, but you can also see if there's like little stress cracks or anything like that forming up around those staking screw hole or staked screw holes there, right? We're going to make sure that the gas key itself doesn't have any chips or dents or burrs or any of that stuff on it, right? Because you get a real deal bullet over bolt or two, and you may, I'm not saying you will, you may have a gas key bend or a burr or something like that. I've seen gas keys hit bent gas tubes, and they would cause burrs on either side, so that kind of stuff. How it got that way, don't ask, I have no idea. And then, of course, just to make sure that stuff goes in well. Look at, again, I'm not absolutely insane about this kind of thing. I just kind of take the shop towel, roll it up, okay? And as I roll it up, I'm just going to make sure that, I'm going to feel it bottom out. I'm going to make sure that there is plenty of room for my bolt to slide in and out without any resistance whatsoever. You can actually see the chrome lining in there is pretty much cleaned off. Now, a big part of ARs and making sure that they run well is to lube them, right? These are guns that do like to run wet, but there are varying instances as far as making sure that they are lubed up, quote unquote, properly, because there's more than one way to do it, and that kind of depends on your time of year. So, just going to make sure that life is a little bit easier. You'll notice that there isn't much focus on the ass end of this, mostly because, to be perfectly honest, the second you get this perfectly clean, it gets really fucked up. So me personally, I'll get in there a little bit. I'll start getting some of the existing junk out, but I don't place a real heavy emphasis on it because right in this area here, okay, is where we start having a little bit of a debate in the gun guy cleaning world, because I've just neglected the ass end of that before for just years. and nothing really negative has come from it. What we're talking about right here is we're talking about getting this thing cleaned up to the point where it's going to cycle reliably, and while we're cleaning it, we're also inspecting it. Now you can get this back here cleaned up real well. You can go in there with a flashlight and on this end too and make sure that you don't have any pitting or that kind of stuff. I'm personally not going to on this one, on this video, mostly because I know that this is full of oil all the time. I know that I don't leave it outside for extended periods of time, that kind of thing. But if you are outside a lot, occasionally doing that is to your benefit more than subtracting things away. So once those components are essentially wiped down, I'm going to make sure that as I assemble stuff, okay, I'm still keeping an eye out for issues, right? And, you know, by the way, when you go to put this extractor back in, you're going to want to push down on this because it's under a lot of spring tension all by itself, right? So you just want to keep that pressed down so you can relieve a little bit of that spring tension, make sure that the pin is even on either side, and then we're good. So some of you may have seen me push out that pin with the firing pin that's here, and there's a lot of guys that are going to be like, well, shouldn't you basically not do that because it's your firing pin, you don't want to chip it and that kind of deal. Ordinarily, I would sit there and agree with you, but having watched soldiers do it forever, having been taught to do it that way because it's a toolless disassembly, quote unquote, and having watched all kinds of meatheads and shit push out their firing pin, their extractor pin, their extractor retention pin, Jesus, can't talk, with that firing pin and not break it, I'm going to say that's a pretty solid way to go about it because soldiers fucking break everything. So I'm sure that somebody's got a story about how, you know, they watched it happen in their unit and blah, 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 but I have not seen it. Oh, by the way, when you put this guy back together, you're going to want to make sure that your extractor is still facing to the right because it won't go out. Your cam pin will not go in correctly if it's not faced to the right. Although I have seen really, really badly out of spec bolts that will fit it the wrong way. So your gun tries to extract to the right. So make sure that your bolt extractor, or the extractor on your bolt, is facing to the friggin' right. Makes sense? So once you got that in there, you're going to want to twist your cam pin so that you got a little T going on. Right? Once you got that set up properly, you can go ahead and just kind of throw your firing pin in there. Make sure that you get your cotter pin in correctly. And once it's in correctly, a good way to make sure that it's in is just to go ahead and slap that bolt. You'll see that the firing pin is trying to come out, but it's blocked by the cotter pin that's in there. So no big deal, that's set aside. Now let's take a look at our upper receiver. There are a couple of things that I care about on this upper receiver. The main one is making sure that your barrel extension or your star chamber is cleaned properly. If that is not cleaned properly, and if you give it enough time, and or if you keep it dry, you're going to get stuck cases. Whether or not it's freaking brass case or steel case, you're going to get stuck cases because this rifle round is a straight wall type case for the most part. There's not much taper in it at all. So if you do not make sure that this is cleaned and lightly lubricated, you're going to have issues. Okay, so I'm going to go into this upper receiver. Okay, and just going in here, you can't just kind of tiptoe into it. You just kind of got to get in there, right? This is one of those guns that when you clean it up, your hands are going to get dirty and that kind of stuff. You know, deal with it. Something else to mention while you're cleaning this kind of stuff. Some guys use like rubber gloves and that kind of thing to clean up their guns. And I used to make fun of them for the longest time. But lead powder poisoning is absolutely a thing, and you'll up your lead exposure over time. And I used to just kind of scoff this off as well, right? Until you start noticing that you start forgetting shit a lot, you know. So over time, I noticed all of the ways that I'm exposing myself to lead that isn't just the shooting part, and that I'm just starting to forget shit. So I started to lead detox as fast as possible, making sure that immediately after cleaning guns, the first thing that I would do is I would wash up and that kind of thing. Where available, wear rubber gloves, that kind of deal. So while sitting here talking about it, you'll notice that I cleaned up in the upper just to make sure that the heavy coated stuff is gone. I'll lean in and I'll inspect some of the surfaces that rub with the carrier, and you can tell which surfaces rub with the carrier because just imagine this inserted that way. This, I'm not worried about this like at all because this is just rubbing on incoming rounds off a magazine. Okay, what I care about is contact points here, 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 and here, and everywhere that makes contact. So on the upper receiver, you'll notice that, okay, you can see where some of these places are scraped up real good, and just look around. Again, it's an inspection thing. I'm going to look at my gas tube, and I'm going to make sure that the gas tube itself isn't bent at all, and that's pretty straight. So once we get in there, now I'm going to start cleaning this guy out. Before I start trying to clean that guy out, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take one of these brushes, okay, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get some lube on it. I'm going to jam it in here, and I'm going to simply just start scraping the stuff out. All this does is just loosen up the junk that's on that's inside of that barrel extension, and it makes it to where now you can start to clean it out and that kind of deal. How you pull the rest of that garbage out is on you. I have a particular method of going about it, but we'll go ahead and simply move my shit out of the way. Shoving this guy in here, and then the next thing that we're going to do is just start turning, okay? Now, I'm not going to try and go against the grain because the cleaning rod is screwed in a particular way and it's just not going to work. I'm just going to go ahead and turn. You might be able to see that turning in there. So, once I've gone ahead and turned that enough, all I'm going to do is yank that guy out and start covering it again, and basically just kind of see what kind of stuff ends up on your little rag here. And by the way, shop towels are amazing. And you can see it ain't just the oil that's in there too. You can usually see little brass fragments and that kind of shit that's in there. So, oh, by the way, that piles up in there as well. So if you don't clean that junk out, you're going to have problems later on. Once we've got that cleaned out, I usually go back in. Okay. Now, I've got tiny little baby digits as far as width, but they're a little bit longer, which helps because I can get in there and I can just basically clean out not the chamber area so much, but the barrel extension itself, what guys refer to as the star chamber, and what sends people back when you're trying to turn in your rifles and shit. So I'll just go in and I'll just start trying to get as much as I can with my little baby digits out of there. And this really is to just free stuff up so it's less work that your bolt has to do when it's locking and unlocking and that kind of stuff. Okay? There isn't an excessive buildup, so you don't have head spacing issues and that kind of thing, because if it builds up enough and then you just let it sit, it turns itself into its own little fossilized coat. And I've seen guys get backed off as far as their head space and that kind of shit before, which results in bad things. But just making sure that as much as you can get is cleaned up well. Okay, and you'll notice that you're starting to get less and less of it. When it's not like super duper duper dirty and that kind of thing, you can bust out lights and that kind of shit. You can start looking around in here. Okay, now Just trying to get a little bit of focus. There we go. So there's still a bunch of junk in there, so I'm going to continue going in there. But, you know, that's really what we're getting at here. We're just trying to make sure that guy's wiped down properly and that we come away with as much junk as possible. And what we're going to do after that here is that we're going to follow it up with a bore snake. Now, there's a lot of guys that have varying theories on cleaning up bores and that kind of deal. I have a particular method that a lot of guys may disagree with vehemently, but that's okay. Now, as far as cleaning this and using a bore snake and that kind of thing, the most important part of using a bore snake on this for me personally is making sure that the chamber area is cleaned out, not so much the barrel. Now, if you have enough carbon and bullshit in your barrel to the point where you're starting to see green stuff out the front end of your muzzle device and that kind of thing, okay, maybe it's time to knock out a little bit of that carbon and that kind of stuff. But what you're looking for here is that guys that are constantly pulling copper and carbon out of their barrels will notice that when they go back to the range and try to zero the damn thing, unless they fire like 100 rounds and then aggressively clean it afterwards, you'll notice that you start to see point of impact shifts, and that's because the copper lining that's pushed into the gun, that's more gradual as far as you just shooting the thing versus you doing a whole bunch of shooting, like a 2-day course, and then making sure that all of that stuff is cleaned out. So what I would say is that cleaning out carbon more than copper is far more important. I don't own copper solvent. I will not use that on my barrels because it's not a life or death type thing. And to me, it's one of those deals where it's just kind of like, after a while, you notice that the more shooting you do, the tighter the gun shoots and that kind of stuff. And even as far as carbon, okay, I shoot quite a bit, and you guys know that. I will clean my barrels out maybe twice a year, right? As far as carbon is concerned, I'll clean them out maybe twice a year. But the one thing that I will make sure is cleaned up is the barrel extension area and the chamber area as well. So, well, how do we get into this? Well, first thing is that I'm going to go ahead and stand this up like so. I'm going to go ahead and get the lubricant that I'm going to use, and I'm going to spray it directly into that barrel extension, right? I'm just going to go ahead and spray it right in there. I'm going to let it foam up, and I'm going to let it sink into the barrel a little bit. Now, this is going to sound like it's a lot of lube at once because it is. So I'm just going to make sure that that goes in there. Those of you that buy that Safariland lube at Walmart and stuff and use it, I use it occasionally. Most of the time I'm using motor oil. I'm just going to spray a whole bunch of that stuff in there. I'm going to stand this up like so, and I'm just going to let it sit until I get a little wet spot in there. It's basically telling me that it ran all the way through. So we're going to come back here in just a second. A couple other things to note on this bolt as well is that something that a lot of guys completely neglect to do, and I almost did during this video, is they will not check out their gas rings and make sure that they're not starting to open up, okay? And a good way to figure out whether or not they open up is to simply push on one side of the piston and look at them. And if you see any elongated gas rings and whatnot, you can see that it's starting to open up, especially if you see them real loose. Make sure that they have a little bit of free movement in there so that they can regulate the gas and do their jobs properly. Now, here's the next thing. Some of you may have noticed that I said the word piston. Direct impingement guns are still piston-operated rifles. Okay, this right here is your piston. Okay, when inserted into the rifle, okay, and when the gas impinges on the gas key, or flows in through the gas key, it impinges upon your piston head, which is the ass end of this bolt, which is why this is constantly covered in crap And for those of you who are wondering whether or not you should make sure that it's glistening and perfectly clean all the time, don't worry about it. Okay? Number one, a whole bunch of carbon is going to refossilize itself on here without any issues whatsoever. Number two, I've shot guns that had thousands on thousands of rounds of all that gas and all that carbon just caked up on a piston head here, and it just didn't really cause any issues. What will cause issues is whether or not your little gas regulators, which are these gas rings, are all in place and or opening up and or broken. Okay, a single missing gas ring can cause you all kinds of cyclic issues, right? So make sure that that's good to go. All right, so now that we can see that we have our own little wet spot here, we know that that lubrication made its way all the way through our barrel. It doesn't really take very long. The next thing that we're going to do here is that I'm going to go ahead and grab a bore snake. Now, a lot of guys use the bore snake as the finishing touches after they bring their wire brushes and all that stuff through. And I know that I'm going to get questions on whether or not you should use a wire brush versus a bore snake and that kind of stuff. A buddy of mine put this thought together, and I think it was a very complete thought because it basically describes everything that I had in long form forever. And he had basically said, I have seen more barrels destroyed by aggressive cleaning than none at all, by a factor of all of them. So I do not use wire brushes on these. One of the main reasons is that especially guys that get aggressive with them will start chipping away at their chrome lining if they're not careful. Guys that sit there and just do this shit over and over again and constantly fist their barrels with freaking wire brushes are going to break shit. Okay? So I would suggest that you not do that. And all we're really doing with these bore snakes, okay, is we're feeding them into one end. Okay? It might actually take a little bit of patience because one end may have a little bit of difficulty getting all the way through because there's a lot of oil in there, right? And all you're doing is just yoking that guy all the way through. Now, a couple of passes and all of the stuff that your oil has been softening up as far as carbon and that kind of shit, because if you let oil sit on carbon for a little while, it just makes it easier to remove. All of that shit is just easier to displace. Okay, so you'll notice that the front end of our barrel here might have a little bit of shine on it. That's just because the excess oil is just being pushed out. Okay. Now, I had a couple of passes through that, and you'll notice that's it for me. Okay. For me, it's 2 in the same direction every time so that I don't massively affect my POI, point of impact. And generally speaking, that is what I've used forever as far as a barrel cleaning. I don't get aggressive with the shit. All I really do is just make sure that, number one, I go in there and I treat the copper lining on that barrel a little bit so I don't get like heavy copper oxidation or rust, right? Because if the copper is just sitting there, the copper itself will oxidize, not the chrome lining itself or whatever, but the copper itself will oxidize, and that's where you get that green shit from. That's why the Statue of Liberty is fucking green. So you go in there, you make sure that it's clean and that kind of stuff. I'm not worried about actually getting in there and scrubbing shit out of the barrel until it's been like 6 months or a year, depending on how much I've shot that gun. This is a very atypical way of me running shit through my barrel. And the main reason for me doing it in the first place isn't even for the barrel. It's to make sure that the chamber area has had all the stuff that I scraped up with this brush pushed out of there. Or at the very least, lightened up quite a bit. Just a couple of passes with it. And you can sit there and you can take a flashlight to it, and it still looks pretty good because bore snakes are real tight on the bores of these things. There's a little bit of a a wire brush in that to start, and to me that's like all that's required. The guns will still shoot accurate, they'll still shoot reliable and that kind of stuff, but making sure that the Achilles heel is taken care of, and that would be the straight wall cased chambers of your AR is taken care of, is the biggest reason for all of this. Okay, it has nothing to do with whether or not the gun's still accurate and stuff. It's to make sure that your bolt moves around as freely as it can inside of the barrel extension, and that your extractor and ejector have less work to do when they're trying to pull that friggin' casing out after you fired a shot. That is the main reason for all that shit. Now, going ahead and assembling this thing all the way, there are a couple of things that I pay attention to before I start lubing things up. Number one is, what time of year is it, and where do I live? For instance, I live in northern Middle Tennessee, and it's fall now. For those of you who know what that is, who know what that's like in Tennessee, you're about to get snow maybe once a year, okay, for like a day. Last year it was 2 weeks and people were losing their minds. But what is going to happen is that you're going to get lots and lots of rain. Now, when I run courses and that kind of stuff, we don't duck out because of the rain. We stick with it and we keep going. Now, when you are expecting rain, what I would suggest is that you make sure that your guns are very wet, because staying outside, keeping your guns exposed, the water will run a bunch of that shit out of your guns. Okay, so making sure that there's enough lubrication for the gun to work well is, to me, rather important. So for me personally, I get really aggressive on my parts when I start lubing stuff up. Okay, because as far as the lubrication and that kind of stuff is concerned, once water starts getting into your system, you can see that I'm covering a lot of the carrier itself, and not just where the carrier runs on the receiver. And that's mostly to help the system shield itself a bit from water. Okay, so you can see a lot of stuff just sitting there on the outside. The next thing that I'm going to go straight for here is I'm going to go for the bolt face itself. I'm going to get a lot of stuff in there and make sure that the lugs are coated and that kind of thing. Make sure that I get inside towards a cam pin, right? And you'll notice that there's definitely a bunch of overlap in here, which is fine. I just make sure that there is as much of this junk in here as possible. Okay, and the thing is that guys that get into lubing up their uppers and that kind of stuff, especially guys that shoot steel case, and guys that go straight into the barrel extension with their lubrication, a really good way to avoid just having to do that is everything that you just saw as far as a cleaning and that kind of stuff, and just making sure that your bolt head is nice and soaked up, because once you insert this guy back into the rifle and get it cycled a bunch of times, you'll notice that barrel extension is very lubed. And for guys that require the extra lubrication to deal with the friction of the steel cases, that will work for you. Now, what I generally like to do after this is I'll start to cycle the rifle and make sure that I cycle it with the magazine well up and with and the whole rifle being pointed down, mostly because once all that stuff is pointed down, what we can go ahead and do is we can start to see that there isn't any drifting of the lubrication into places that are useless, like the magazine well and that kind of stuff. So we're going to go ahead and simply cycle it upside down for a bit. And what we're also doing here is that all of the lubrication that we put into our moving components, just the movement of the parts themselves gets that lubrication to other places that need it, right? So here's the next thing that I'm going to suggest that you do. Once you get a function check in there, just to make sure that you didn't do something stupid, okay, where safety on, press. Okay, works. Can't put the safety on with the hammer dropped. Fantastic. So the next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and load it. because personally, I have a whole thing about keeping guns loaded all the time, and that kind of deal. If you have questions about that, freaking, I have a video on it. When I take this off the bench, and when I go to store this wherever it is that I want to store it, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to store that standing up, right? Because if it's stood up in your safe or whatever, what you'll notice is that standing up is going to make sure that all of this lubrication doesn't really go into a place that doesn't need it. Your buffer and shit doesn't need any of that. Okay. What's going to happen is that all this stuff is going to run into here, and it's just going to keep going into a place, into areas that need it. Your barrel extension and your chamber area, for one. And number two, if you just let it sit there for a while, you'll notice that you have a bunch of little spots in your safe or whatever. That is your oil running out. Yes, but it's running out in the direction of parts that actually need this stuff, and that's what helps coat and protect your gun and all that stuff. You fire the first shot out of this thing, and it'll be a little smoky. It's no big deal. There are guys that worry about overpressure and that kind of stuff from this being too wet. The way that you make sure that it isn't too wet and that you build up those extra pressures and all that shit is to simply store it upside down. Now, how long does it take for enough of it to bleed out before it's not an issue anymore? If I clean this right here and now, set it right here and now, and end up going to shoot tomorrow, right? Like, let's say that I just came off a day at class, and let's say that it's like 9 or 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the evening. I clean it, set it upside down at 11 o'clock, and we're going to do some more shooting again by 8 the next day. You're good. Okay. Yeah, there's going to be some smokiness and all that stuff from oil that's behind your gas piston, and that's currently covering up the vent holes for your gas bleed off and all that stuff. Really, that's no big deal. Okay. You're fine, I promise. So, really no big deal there. If you have any other additional questions or anything like that, just let me know. I know this was a rather lengthy video, but this isn't just a disassembly and cleaning. It's also an inspection video as well. Make sense? Oh, and last thing. Just make sure that all of your stuff that has screws involved, everything's still tight. If you got rattling in your pistol grip or your castle nut, which you shouldn't if it's staked, which you should stake them. But guys get away with making them real tight and using red Loctite, that kind of stuff. Just stake them. It makes a lot of that go away. I used to be the guy that's just kind of like, you don't really need to stake them, but it just takes a lot of the what if away. So just do that. But everything that's supposed to be tight, make sure it's still tight. Optics, mounts, that kind of stuff. So if it isn't, you can tighten it up then, rather than figuring it out while you're pressing triggers on shit. So, I could sit here and talk about, the safety aspects and all that shit, but realistically speaking, people watching this are adults. Unload your fucking guns before you clean them. So it's as simple as that. All right, guys, that's all I got here. If you want to come and take some training with us, there's all kinds of shit available on the website. Oh, by the way, I'm getting ready to set up classes and do shit in Nevada. So you California boys that want to come out and play, it's going to come real soon. So remember, guys, regular guys' firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.